What's up, WAP? This is Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 3, 1450 to 1750, although technically it's Unit 4 because I talked about it last time. I combined the first two videos. This is 1450 to 1750, the age of early modern world, the age of exploration. This is going to be the age of exploration, and you're going to see the development of political revolutions during this time start at the very end of the unit. So this is not the age of revolutions with American, French, and British. That's next unit, but it's going to really start, the ball will start rolling at the very end of this unit. The overall themes during this unit is you're going to see the rise of absolute monarchies and centralized governments in Western Europe. You'll see the expansion of global trade, the birth of consumerism, the beginning of the birth of the Industrial Revolution at the very end of the unit, and Commercial Revolution, the rise of Europe as the major force of labor, the expansion of slavery and African slavery, religious rivalry, the Protestant Reformation, and the decline of nomads. Around 1300, the population decline will be big result in Western Europe as a result of the Black Death, which will actually lead to serfs and workers being able to negotiate for more of their contract and having a better deal, and serfdom dying in Western Europe, although serfdom does not die in in Russia. You will see feudalism in Japan and Europe, although that starts to fall apart in Western Europe. The Yuan dynasty in China, Kievan Rus under the Mongol rule, the rise of the Inca and Aztec empires, and Mali was at its height. And a lot is going to change in the next 150 years. Dun dun dun! The Delhi Sultanate was in Southeast Asia. You had the rise of Islam and the decline of Buddhism. Buddhism was starting to lose power in India and China. The founding of the Ottoman Empire in 1281, and the Ottoman Empire is eventually going to destroy the Byzantine Empire in 1453. The continued decline of the Byzantine Empire. And you'll see trade circuit routes through the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Trans-Saharan Desert. Silk roads not got a lot of love anymore. Remember, with the expansion of the Mongol Empire and the death of the Mongol Empire, a lot of the trade routes are becoming sea-based trade routes now. So let's talk first. We'll talk first about the Chinese empires, the Ming and the Qing dynasty. The Ming dynasty was the ones that threw out the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols. The original Ming emperor was a peasant. They're going to revive Confucian Chinese culture. They're going to reintroduce Neo-Confucianism in the Chinese bureaucracy. The social culture will be the emperor, although he didn't have a lot of political power. The scholar gentry, who did most of the governance. The farmers, the artisans, and then, of course, at the very bottom, the merchants. You will see a population explosion under the Ming dynasty with the introduction of champa rice, which had been introduced before, but it's going to help to increase population. You'll see public works. You'll see reforestation and irrigation, so they actually plant trees. You'll see Chinese goods like paper, porcelain, and silk are going to be demanded throughout Europe and Asia. Europeans are going to be allowed to come through Macau and Canton to do business, and you will see some Europeans start to reach China for trade, although the terms of trade they get, the trade routes, are very heavily against them. The Chinese are going to be heavily trading in the Indian Ocean along Hangzhou, Qingzhou, and Guangzhou, and they'll trade for silver with Europe and Japan, which causes a trade imbalance. The Ming Chinese dynasty are going to be absolute monarchies. The Hongao are going to remove the chief minister positions. They'll establish a bureaucracy. They'll develop the imperial city and the forbidden city. Under Hangao, he'll kill rivals through a rule of terror, public beatings. The civil service examination will be reintroduced along with foot binding. He'll choose imperial wives from humble families. He'll limit the number of eunuchs. Remember, a lot of the eunuchs had caused Chinese rebellions before. He will censor writings, and he'll continue to do the subordination of youth to elders and women to men. We talked about Emperor Yongzhou, how he allowed Zheng He to do his explorations. It's going to be stopped after 1423 because it was too costly, and the Neo-Confucians and the Confucian bureaucrats did not like it. The Ming dynasty is going to decline because of poor leadership, corrupt government. The public works are going to fail, and there's going to be foreign threats. Japanese pirates and Manchus from the north are going to start to attack the Ming dynasty, and eventually the Manchus from the north are going to conquer China and establish the Qing dynasty, which maybe we'll talk about, maybe not. The next one, let's talk about Japan. Japan establishes the Tokugawa shogunate, which is going to be the most powerful shogunate, which is going to last throughout this unit and up until halfway through the next unit. Oda Nobunaga was the first shogun of Japan that starts unification. He is assassinated. One of his generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, continues and launches attacks on Korea and continues with the unification of Japan to make it a feudal state. Although Remember, Japanese feudalism was much stronger than European feudalism. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu actually consolidates power and creates a unified Japan, and he becomes shogun, and his shogunate is going to be passed to his descendants up until the 1850s, 1854. Ieyasu ate the pie that Nobunaga made and Hideyoshi baked. Okay, whatever. Tokugawa Japan will create a new capital in Edo. They will not continue their overseas expansions that was launched by Hideyoshi, but they will concentrate internally to make Japan strong internally. They'll lead the bureaucracy and control the daimyo. Remember, the daimyo actually had to do what the emperor said. If the shogun, what the shogun said, if the shogun said that the daimyo had to commit seppuku, they would. They will ensure Tokugawa's succession. They will try to limit the power of Western Europeans, and the emperor will be a figurehead. Agriculture will increase during this time, improve farming techniques. They will welcome trade at first, but really they're only going to allow the Dutch in. They're going to close the country through edicts, and Japan's going to go through self-imposed isolation. They only allow the Dutch in once a year. They're going to ban Christianity. It threatened loyalty to the shogun. They'll ban Western books. And only the Dutch and Chinese could trade at Nagasaki once a year. And they will ensure a rigid class structure, and they will adapt Neo-Confucianism. And Japan will be isolated for the next 250 years. Let's talk about the Ottoman Empire, which is going to be the major Islamic empire during this time. The Ottomans will have a lot of land, but they're never going to reach the heights of the Abbasids or the Umayyads. The Abbasids will be known for invading Europe under Osman and starting to conquer the Byzantine Empire. And under Osman the Great, he's considered the father of the Ottomans. Under one of his grandchildren, Sultan Mehmed II, he captures Constantinople and kills the Byzantine Empire. The most famous Ottoman emperor is Suleiman the Magnificent, who actually advances into Eastern and Central Europe. In 1683, the Ottomans try to capture Austria again in Vienna, and they fail. And this really starts the slow, painful decline of the Ottoman Empire, which is going to last for the next 250 years. The Ottoman Empire will be led by the Sultan. He was an absolute monarch. He had his own harem of women and all that bad stuff. They did have a bureaucracy, a vizier, who was granted on merit, and the vizier was the one that really had the power in the Ottoman Empire. They had their own unique military force, which was led by soldiers with guns. They were former Christians and Jews. The Janissaries, remember the Janissaries? They did offer religious tolerance. Remember, they did the millet system, where they would give those little religious communities their own form of kind of self-government. But they would the religious leader of each millet would be responsible to the Sultan if there's rebellion. They were gunpowder civilization. They were a land empire. The Ottoman Empire is going to decline slowly. The sultans will neglect power. There'll be vague processes of succession. There'll be Harlem politics. The empire was too large, corrupt officials, and lack of change in military technology. Once the Janissaries become the dominant military force, they don't want to give up the power they have. The next one is the Mughal Empire, which was in India from 1526 to 1739. Babur, who was a descendant of Timur the Lame, is going to invade northern India and establish the Mughal Empire. It was also a gunpowder empire. The most famous one you should know is Akbar the Great. He granted religious tolerance. One of the biggest problems in Muslim India was the conflict between Hindus and Muslims, which still is today. He tries to combine beliefs to create a unified religion, Dini Lana, or the divine faith, which is not successful. The major textile trade, the major trade with the Europeans will be textiles, although the spices are still a big deal also. He will do patronage to the arts, and you'll see syncretism and blend of Muslim and Islamic culture. And the most famous example of that is the Taj Mahal. The Mughal Empire is going to fall as the Europeans start to get more and more of a foothold in India. Eventually, the British become the dominant power in India. There'll be corruption and neglect. One of Akbar's children, Aurangzeb, gets rid of the tolerance policies against the Hindus, and a lot of the Hindus will welcome the British in at first, which was probably a mistake on their part. The army was behind the times. There were high taxes. They're going to get rid of Akbar's religious tolerance. There'll be peasant uprisings and foreign invaders. Let's talk about Rise of the West. The age of the exploration is going to start around the late early 1400s. The Chinese give up on exploration, which is going to leave a vacuum open for Portugal and Spain. Portugal is going to be the first one to search for a maritime route to Asia, to try to counteract trading with the Muslims with their high prices. They're going to the king of Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator, is going to commission Vasco da Gama to go circumnavigate Africa to get to India directly. They're going to have advanced naval technology, caravels, carracks, astrolabe, and compass. They'll establish fortresses along the Gold Coast, those trading towns, those trading forts, for sugar plantations, and eventually they're going to start to trade for African slave labor. They'll trade with rival tribes to capture slaves for them, and then they'll start sending those slaves into the New World. You're going to see the Indian Ocean trade and da Gama, like we talked about before, and you'll start to see the Indian Atlantic trade, which will be known as the triangular trade, where they send the slaves to Africa. The African slaves make raw products like sugar and the sugar plantations, which is brought to Europe to be turned into finished products through manufacturing, like candy. Brazil will be the Portuguese colony that they established in Latin America. During the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain was given basically all the Americas except for Brazil. The Brazilians are going to use, the Portuguese are going to use Brazil as a plantation colony for sugar and later coffee. And it's going to be the largest producer of sugar in the world and the largest producer of slaves in the world at first through most of the 17th century. Spain's going to be another dominant power during this time. With the end of the Reconquista, Spain's going to become a unified empire and have control over all Granada, all of Iberia except for Portugal. They're going to sponsor Christopher Columbus's voyages. Cortez is going to be able to destroy the Aztec Empire and Pizarro the Inca Empire, and they're going to have control over all of Central America and Latin America and South America. They'll start to expand into North America like California, Texas, later on in the 1700s. They'll take over existing tributary empires. They'll use like the Meta system, which we remember was like the labor system where the laborers would have to work in the mines for a certain amount of time, and the Native American villages would have to give a certain amount of laborers for certain times in the year. You had the encomienda system, which we talked about before, which was like the religious-based slavery. How if they don't convert to Christianity, the Native Americans could be used as slaves. But for the most parts, the Native Americans are not going to be the best forms of labor, so we're going to see a switch to African slavery as time goes on. You also will see the birth of mestizos, the blending of Native American and Spanish culture. One of the other major trading empires during this time was the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company was a joint stock company. You really need to remember what a joint stock company is. It was formed in 1616 and is going to allow the expansion of the Dutch into Southeast Asia. They're going to conquer New York, New Amsterdam, and they'll establish colonies in the Caribbean for plantation settlement. They also established a settlement in South Africa, Cape Town. They will be big in the spice trade, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. Next one is France. France was an absolute monarchy, and they were probably the ideal absolute monarchy. They were really interested in a lot of European wars going on. They fought a lot of their neighbors. They also are going to be involved in overseas expansion. The most famous absolute monarchy was Louis XIV. I am the state. I am France. He establishes the Palace of Versailles. France was mercantilist. You really need to remember what mercantilism is. If you don't know, ask me tomorrow. They are going to have territorial expansions in Europe, and they're going to establish colonies in Canada, the Ohio River Valley, and they'll try to fight for India and parts of Southeast Asia, but they will not be successful. England is going to be a little bit different. Like the Dutch, they'll be a constitutional monarchy. They'll have civil wars like the Glorious Revolution and the revolutions against the Puritans. They established things like the Magna Carta, which was last unit, which I didn't mention, and the English Bill of Rights. And there was a legislative branch, and the king did not have all power. The Enlightenment are probably going to have the most ideas in England, the idea of natural rights and stuff. And they're going to establish colonies in the Americas, where they're going to have a revolution eventually, in North America, in India. They'll conquer they'll eventually kick the Dutch out of South Africa. And by 1750, they're going to be the largest empire in the world. Iberian Peninsula versus Northern Europe. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, are going to be Catholic, agricultural, and the purpose of the colony is going to be for the crown. The Northern Europe are going to be Protestant mostly, except for France. They're going to be more manufacturing. They're going to go through the Industrial Revolution, the very beginning of it. And really the purpose of these Northern European colonies are going to be for trading companies, joint stock companies, and to make money. And ultimately, this side is going to be more successful, and this side is going to win the battle of the colonial rivalries. From 1450 to 1750, the Americas are going to be colonized. It's going to start with the arrival of the Spanish in Western Hemisphere. The biggest impact, the biggest killer of the Native Americans was disease. You will see racist intermingling with the Spain and the Portuguese. The English and the Dutch were a little bit more distrustful and a little bit more racist against the Native Americans, although the Spanish were pretty bloodthirsty also. And they'll be less likely to intermarry. You're going to see new social groups form in Latin America as a result of the intermarrying. You'll have the Peninsulari. That was the European that was born in Spain or Portugal. The Creole, which was the white European that was born in the New World. Mestizo, blend of Native American and Creole. Mulatto, blend of African and Creole. African, Native American, and Zombos, blend of African and Native American. You'll see the rise of the Columbian Exchange, the trade of goods, disease, and ideas from the New World to the Old World. You'll start to see the rise of colonial societies. In the English societies, there will be some more self-government, but in the Spanish and Portuguese societies, there'll be viceroys and audiencias, and the king of Spain and Portugal have much more direct involvement in the government in Latin America through the governors they appoint. So there's not going to be self-government. And as a result, the English are going to be the ones that have the revolution first before the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. In Command system, remember I mentioned that. There will be changes in trade and technology, exploration, remember the motives of gold, God, and glory, empire building, cartography, and commodities. We have some commodities during this time. Sugar, silver is going to be a big thing. The Chinese are going to start to only trade with the British with silver when the British want tea, which will eventually cause resentment and will eventually, in a couple hundred years, lead to the Opium War. Slaves are going to be a huge commodity and the biggest result of trade during this time. Coffee beans were first used in Islam, in Yemen, which was in the Islamic empires, but later they'll be brought to Europe and they'll start to be produced in the Americas, in Brazil. Europeans will start to use chocolate technology from the Aztecs in the 17th century. You'll start to see cartographical changes of how the world looks like, and it'll be more accurate. The African empires will be stateless societies. A lot of these societies will be organized around kinship, often larger than states. There will be some still states in the African societies. The only areas the Europeans really conquer in Africa are the areas around the coast, around the ocean. They couldn't conquer interior Africa because of disease and because of transportation and communication. It's not going to be till the rise of like the railroad and the steam engine that Europeans are going to conquer all of Africa. There will be some centralized bureaucracies in Africa, and you'll see different lingual bases based on Bantu, Christianity, and Islam, as well as indigenous beliefs. Africa will still have trade during this time and markets. International commerce, and unprocessed goods. Some of the major African empires we talked about during this time were Benin, which was a Muslim African empire which was a Muslim African empire in West Africa. Congo, which was the first African empire to convert to Christianity, and they actually went to war against Portugal when Portugal still tried to capture them for slaves. And Asante, which is one of the African empires that tried to model themselves after the Europeans. They helped the Europeans capture slaves. And they tried to create divine monarchies also. East Africa is still going to have the Swahili city-states, although it loses some power with the fall of the Muslims. They will trade with the Ottomans with ivory, gold, silver, and people. They'll participate in the slave trade. Remember, there were two slave routes. There was the Atlantic slave trade to the New World. There was also the African slave trade through the Middle East. That was the land route. And the African slave trade actually lasts longer than the Atlantic slave trade, although it has a lot less people go through it. We'll see the rise of some empires. After the Mongols are going to kick the Russians out in the 13th, 14th century. They are going to be an absolute monarchy, but they're going to have a territory expansion under Ivan the Terrible, although he also kills thousands of his own people. There'll be a multicultural empire. They'll span multiple regions. Under Peter the Great, he's going to try to modernize and westernize Russia. The boyars were the Russian princes who are going to resent that the Tsar is trying to get control. The Cossacks were the people that the Tsar would get to move into Central Asia to defend them from the nomads, and in return they were given land. They were a lot of peasants. And serfs were the dominant force of labor in Eastern Europe and in Russia. The Russians do not get rid of serfdom, unlike Western Europe. The Russian Orthodox Church will have a big role in Russia, but it is going to be really below the Tsar, because the Tsar was Caesar a papist, and they believed the Tsar of Russia was the head of the church and the government. We'll see changing beliefs during this time, the Protestant Reformation, Neo-Confucianism, and the spread of missionaries for Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. We'll see cultural and intellectual developments. I didn't even talk about the scientific revolution, but you definitely need to know that. The Enlightenment, and you'll see patronages of the arts and like the Akbar, under Akbar and the Mughals, all over the world, under the Italian Renaissance, all over the world. And that's all I have for this video, kids. That's 1450 to 1750. I have nothing else. Hope you enjoyed Unit 4. If you have any questions, leave me a comment on YouTube. Deuces.